I came to my sister's wedding expecting a day for family, not a lesson in humiliation. My grandmother Eleanor had traveled from Bordeaux at 79, crossing an ocean just to be here. She built the vineyard where the vows would be spoken, her life's work in every row of vines. Yet I found her tucked away on a flimsy chair beside two overflowing trash bins and the hum of the kitchen vent. My father stood across the courtyard smiling with his guests as if nothing was wrong. I crossed to him, called it out in front of everyone, and before I could even take a step back, his hand struck my face. The chatter stopped, eyes turned, and security took me by the arm, leading me out past rows of silent stairs. I was still catching my breath when I heard it, tires rolling slow over gravel, and the air around me shifted. The morning light in Napa Valley had that soft golden tint that makes the rows of vines look like they were brushed on with watercolor. I turned off the highway and followed the narrow road toward Carmen's Grace, the vineyard my grandmother built decades ago. My hands had been gripping the wheel for hours on the drive from Portland, and yet the sight of those hills made my stomach tighten instead of relax. The parking lot was already crowded with imported cars, polished so bright they threw little flashes of sunlight across the gravel. I slipped my old sedan into a space at the far end and sat there for a moment, staring at the main house. White stone, green shutters, the smell of roses drifting even this far out. My little sister's wedding day. Sabrina Cole, the center of attention since she could walk, was about to take that attention to a whole new level. Inside the courtyard, the air was busy and fragrant. Waiters in crisp black vests carried trays of champagne flutes that glittered in the light. Women in satin gowns leaned in to kiss cheeks. Men in tailored suits shook hands like deals were being made. I walked slowly, taking it in the sound of a string quartet under the pergola mixing with the murmur of small talk. I saw her before anyone else did. My grandmother Eleanor Whitford was sitting alone at the far side of the patio. Her cream jacket was pressed, her silver hair set neatly, but the chair beneath her was a flimsy white plastic one pushed against a wall beside two overflowing trash bins. The air there carried the sour hum of the catering vent. She looked impossibly small in that corner, but when her eyes found me, they lit up. I crossed the patio quickly, ignoring the way a few guests glanced at my off-the-rack dress. "Grandma, what are you doing back here?" I asked, touching her hand. Her skin was cool. "They said this was my place," she said softly, and gave a small shrug like she was trying to make it sound like nothing. I looked around. 20 feet away, the family table gleamed under white linen and crystal. Empty seats, gold name cards waiting. My jaw tightened. Across the courtyard, my father was standing with a group of men, his shoulders squared, laughing at something one of them had said. Robert Cole, always the host, always the one in control. I walked straight toward him, heels clipping against the flagstone. "Why is Grandma sitting by the trash?" I asked, loud enough that his friends heard. He glanced past me toward her corner, and then back at me, his smile fixed in place. "She insisted," he said. "No, she didn't. There are empty seats at the family table." His expression hardened. "Marissa, this is not the time." "It's exactly the time," I said, feeling the heat rise in my face. "She flew all the way from France to be here, and you put her next to the garbage." He leaned in, his voice low but sharp. "That old woman doesn't belong at the front. She smells like mothballs, and she'll talk about the vineyard like she still runs it." My chest went cold. "She built that vineyard," I said, "and you're embarrassing yourself." Something flickered in his eyes, something ugly and fast. Before I could step back, his hand came across my face hard enough to make the courtyard spin for a moment. The sound cracked the air, louder than the quartet, louder than the chatter. A few gasps broke the silence that followed. "You don't speak to me like that," he said, his jaw tight. "Security, show her out." I tasted metal and kept my eyes on his. Around us, people stared, pretending they weren't. My father's friends shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. A man in a black suit approached, his hand gesturing toward the exit. I straightened my shoulders and turned without a word. The walk across the patio felt longer than the drive from Portland. I caught sight of Sabrina in her gown, the lace glittering under the afternoon sun. She was standing with her new in-laws, smiling for a photo, and when her eyes met mine, she didn't frown, didn't wave, didn't do anything at all. By the time I stepped through the side gate, the laughter and music had closed behind me. I crossed the gravel path toward the edge of the parking lot, the smell of blooming jasmine giving way to the faint diesel scent from the delivery trucks. The sting on my cheek throbbed in rhythm with my heartbeat, but I kept my chin up, moving toward the far wall that edged the property. I found a low stone bench in the shade of an olive tree and sat down, my hands folded in my lap. From here I could see the vineyard stretching into the distance, rows and rows of green under the pale sky. Somewhere inside, champagne corks were popping, toasts were being made, and my grandmother was still sitting beside the trash. I didn't cry. I just watched the dust settle on the road and listened to the distant hum of voices, wondering what in the world could possibly come next. The sound reached me before I saw anything, a deep, steady crunch of heavy tires on gravel. I lifted my head toward the main drive, and the afternoon light caught the curve of a long black limousine easing its way under the olive trees. Sunlight slid across the dark windows, glinting like a signal. Behind it, two smaller sedans followed in slow formation. For a second, I thought I was imagining it, that maybe some late guests had decided to make an entrance. But then the flags on the front fenders came into view, the kind you only see on diplomatic cars, and I felt the air shift. The drivers kept their pace, unhurried, the kind of arrival that told everyone they belonged here. The limousine came to a stop near the private entrance by the side courtyard. A uniformed chauffeur stepped out and moved to open the rear door. My grandmother emerged first, one hand on the silver handle of her cane, the other holding the edge of a pale ivory coat that caught the sun in a soft shimmer. Her hair was pinned in its usual French twist, a style I had seen in old photographs of her from Bordeaux, and around her neck hung the thin gold chain she never took off. Two men in dark suits flanked her, scanning the area without saying a word. I stood automatically. She had only left Bordeaux yesterday morning, boarded her own jet at Marignac, flown halfway across the world to San Francisco, and transferred to Napa County Airport, where a limousine waited. It had been less than an hour since she stepped off that plane. Now she was here, her presence as sharp and deliberate as the first cut of pruning shears in spring. She looked around, her eyes pausing on the main house where music still floated through open doors. Then she spotted me under the olive tree. The corners of her mouth softened just a fraction. She started toward me, her cane clicking lightly against the stone path. I met her halfway. "Grandma," I started, but the words caught. Her gaze moved over my face, lingering just enough to make me wonder if she could still see the faint outline of my father's hand. Without asking, she reached up and brushed her fingertips along my cheek. The touch was cool, steady. "You are coming with me," she said simply. I glanced toward the side gate. "They will not like it," I murmured. She straightened, her posture suddenly taller than the two men beside her. "I did not come all this way to be told where I may sit." The men in suits moved ahead, one of them pushing the gate open. I fell into step beside her, matching my pace to hers. The scent of her perfume, something floral and sharp, cut through the heavier smells of food and wine drifting from the courtyard. As we walked, I could feel my pulse in my throat. Images from the last half hour crowded my mind, my father's cold expression, the sting on my face, the way guests had looked away. Part of me wanted to turn back to avoid another scene, but another part burned hotter with each step toward the house. She leaned slightly toward me. "When I was your age, Marissa, I learned that silence is what they count on. Do not give it to them." We reached the edge of the courtyard. Through the open arch, I could see the family table gleaming under the afternoon light, still missing one chair. My grandmother's chair. The quartet played something slow, almost tentative, as if they sensed the change in the air. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes froze when he saw her. His eyes darted from her face to the security men and then to me, but he stepped aside without a word. We passed through the arch and onto the stone terrace, the sound of our footsteps drawing the attention of those seated closest to the aisle. Heads turned, conversations stalled. My father was near the head of the table, speaking with Sabrina's future in-laws. The moment his eyes landed on us, his jaw set. He took a step forward as if to intercept, but my grandmother kept moving, her cane tapping in an unbroken rhythm. She did not look at him. She did not look at Sabrina, who had gone pale under her bridal makeup. Instead, she headed straight for the small platform where the officiant stood arranging papers. The two men in suits stopped at the foot of the steps, but she climbed them without hesitation. I hung back a few paces, the weight of every gaze in the courtyard settling somewhere between my shoulder blades. My father called her name once sharply, but she did not respond. She reached the microphone, rested her hand lightly on it, and looked out over the crowd. The music faltered, then stopped altogether. In the silence, even the rustle of her coat was audible. I stayed near the side, heart hammering, knowing something was about to break open. The afternoon light had shifted, turning the stone warm beneath my feet, but the air felt cooler, expectant. My grandmother's eyes swept the room, once steady and unblinking, before she drew a breath to speak. Her voice came low at first, so low I thought she might only be speaking to me, but then it carried clear and unwavering to the far corners of the courtyard. Heads turned, murmurs died mid-breath. She didn't ask for permission. She simply reached for the microphone, her fingers curling around it like it had always belonged in her hand. I am Eleanor Bennett, founder of Carmen's Grace. The one who planted the first vines when this land was still dust and hope. The one who poured decades into making this place a home. Her words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, rippling through the crowd. Even the waitstaff froze, with trays balanced midair. The string quartet at the far end of the terrace lowered their bows. She looked at the crowd, not flustered, not apologetic. Then her gaze settled on my father. I've crossed an ocean to be here to celebrate my granddaughter's wedding. And yet my seat was placed next to a trash bin and a kitchen vent, as if I were an afterthought in my own vineyard. Her tone never cracked, but each word was precise, deliberate, sharpened by years of knowing when to cut and when to wait. My father's jaw tightened, a pulse beating hard at his temple. He tried to smile, a politician's smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sabrina, standing near the photographer, shifted from one heel to the other. Her bouquet dipped slightly. Ethan's hand twitched at his side like he was caught between wanting to intervene and not knowing who to protect. My grandmother's cane made a single slow tap against the flagstones. I am ashamed. Not for myself, but for those who think respect can be denied to someone who built the very ground beneath their feet. A rustle moved through the guests, some glancing toward Robert, others avoiding his gaze entirely. I spotted Mrs. Davenport from the neighboring estate purse her lips so tightly they nearly vanished. Robert finally spoke, his voice low but edged. Mother, this isn't the time or place. She didn't even blink. Respect has no schedule, Robert. You either have it or you don't. Sabrina let out a small forced laugh that died when no one joined her. Grandma's eyes moved to her. And you, my dear. You have been raised to believe appearances matter more than truths. That will serve you poorly in the years ahead. Sabrina's cheeks flushed a deep pink. She looked toward Ethan for backup, but he only shifted his weight, his face unreadable. The officiant, who had been standing awkwardly to the side, cleared his throat. Eleanor, perhaps we should. She lifted one hand palm outward, and the man stopped speaking immediately. I will not take more than a few minutes. But before this ceremony continues, there are matters that must be acknowledged. I could feel my heart pounding, not from fear this time, but from something almost electric. There had been so many years where I wished someone would call my father out publicly, where I imagined someone slicing through the false smiles and careful lies. And here she was doing exactly that under the spring sun in front of 100 witnesses. A child in the back asked their mother something in a whisper, and the mother hushed them quickly. The only other sounds were the faint rustle of vines in the breeze and the distant hum of a delivery truck on the road beyond the gates. Grandma's voice softened but somehow grew stronger. This vineyard is not just a business. It is a legacy. It is family. And I will not stand by while that legacy is tainted by cruelty or greed. My father took a step forward, but she turned slightly, angling her cane like a quiet warning. I watched the tendons in his hands pull tight, his breath drawing in sharply through his nose. From my spot near the side, I saw the guests' expressions shift, curiosity giving way to something sharper, a readiness for whatever revelation she might be leading toward. You will all hear the rest soon, she told them, scanning the courtyard. But for now, let it be known that this vineyard stands because I built it and I decide who belongs here. Robert's eyes darkened. Sabrina's lips parted like she might argue, but Grandma's gaze silenced her before the words could form. The moment felt stretched, suspended in the warm light, and yet the air around us was taut as wire. I could almost see the invisible lines being drawn in the room: who would side with her, who would cling to Robert, who would pretend they hadn't heard a thing. Then she handed the microphone back to the officiant, but she did not sit. Instead, she remained standing at the center, her back straight, her eyes never leaving my father's face. I wanted to step forward to stand beside her, but something told me to wait to let her hold the stage. She had not come all this way for me to interrupt. Robert forced another smile, brittle and thin. "Well, perhaps we can move on with the ceremony. Not until I say so," she replied, her voice so calm it might have been mistaken for polite conversation if not for the steel beneath it. A shiver ran through me, though the sun was warm on my skin. I knew whatever she was about to do next was not just about a bad seat at a wedding. This was about years of disrespect, about buried truths finally cracking the surface. I looked at Sabrina again. She was staring at her bouquet, now twisting the stems in her hands until a petal fell to the stone. Ethan stood beside her, lips pressed together, eyes fixed on my grandmother. Guests shifted in their chairs, glancing at one another, waiting for the next move. My father stayed silent, but the flush in his cheeks was deepening. The silence stretched again, thicker now, until Grandma said, "We will continue, but not until every wrong done here today is brought into the light." No one spoke. The breeze moved lazily through the vines, carrying with it the faint scent of roses from the floral arch. I drew a slow breath, steadying myself. This was the beginning of something. I could feel it in my bones. Something irreversible. And whatever happened after, there would be no pretending we could go back to how things were before. Grandma's voice didn't waver as she turned toward the crowd again, her cane angled lightly against the stone. She said she had one more thing to make clear before any vows were spoken. Her words felt like they carried their own weight, pulling everyone in closer without them even moving. 3 years ago, when I fell ill, there was only one person who came to sit by my bed day after day, she said. One person who read to me when I could not keep my eyes open, who made sure I ate when the pain stole my appetite. That was Marissa. A murmur went through the guests, some looking at me, others shifting awkwardly in their seats. My cheeks warmed, not from shame, but from the unexpected swell of hearing her say it out loud. She lifted her chin slightly, eyes sweeping the front rows. Because of that, I made changes to my will in 2021. The majority of my holdings, including Carmen's Grace, were to pass to Marissa. That was my decision, made while I was of sound mind and with my attorney present. My father's head snapped toward her. "That is not true," he said, his voice low but carrying. "You were already struggling then. We had to step in." She did not even glance at him. "What is true, Robert, is that you and Sabrina filed fraudulent medical documents claiming I was no longer capable of making decisions for myself." Gasps broke out across the courtyard. Sabrina's fingers tightened around her bouquet until the stems creaked. Ethan's mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but he closed it again. Grandma's gaze was steady, cutting through the noise. "Those papers gave you control over my medical and personal affairs. You used them to block my attorney from meeting with me and to take over operations here without my consent." Robert stepped forward, his hands half raised in a gesture that was meant to look like reason but felt more like control. "We did what we thought was best for the business. You were confused, disoriented." From the corner of my eye, I saw a tall man in a gray suit rise from one of the shaded tables. Harvey Landon, Grandma's attorney. His presence had been easy to overlook until now, but the moment he walked toward the center, the shift in the air was immediate. "I am Harvey Landon," he said, his voice carrying with the authority of someone used to courtrooms. "I have been Mrs. Bennett's attorney for 12 years. The claims of mental incapacity filed by Robert and Sabrina Bennett were not only false, they were contradicted by multiple medical evaluations from licensed physicians." Robert's mouth tightened. "That is not." Harvey raised a hand, slightly cutting him off without even looking at him. "Last week, after months of obstruction, we finalized a legal transfer of authority in accordance with Mrs. Bennett's original wishes. As of May 10th, Marissa Cole is the sole managing partner and controlling owner of Carmen's Grace Vineyards." The words seemed to echo in the open air. I could hear the shuffle of feet, the rustle of dresses, the low hum of whispers, as people processed what had just been said. My pulse was in my ears. Grandma's eyes met mine briefly, and there was the faintest glint of something relief maybe, or satisfaction. She turned back to the crowd. This is not about money. This is about restoring the truth. The vineyard was meant for someone who understands its worth beyond profit. Someone who stood by me when I had nothing to give in return. Sabrina's voice cut in sharp but trembling. This is insane. You can't just walk in here, and Harvey's gaze shifted to her, calm but unyielding. The documents have been signed, notarized, and filed. Your father's and your actions are now a matter of legal record. Any further interference will be addressed in court. Robert took a step toward him. You think you can scare me with legal threats? I do not need to scare you, Mr. Bennett. The law will handle that. The murmur of the guests grew louder, some leaning toward each other, others openly watching Robert's face as the color drained slightly from it. My grandmother rested both hands on the head of her cane. This vineyard is no longer under your control. From this day forward, your access to its operations, its accounts, and its name is revoked. Robert let out a short, bitter laugh, but it sounded forced. We will see about that. Harvey's voice was almost quiet, but it cut through the noise. You already have. And you lost. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the shifting weight of public humiliation. I could see the calculation in Robert's eyes as he looked from Grandma to me to the guests who were now witnesses to his defeat. Ethan cleared his throat, glancing at Sabrina, but she kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her knuckles pale around the bouquet. I realized my hands were clenched at my sides. This was the kind of moment you imagine in the quiet hours when you think about justice, but I had never thought I would see it play out in daylight in front of everyone who had been complicit by their silence. Grandma's final words were steady. That is all I will say for now. Let the wedding proceed if it must, but the truth has been spoken. She stepped back and Harvey moved with her, offering an arm, though she didn't take it. I stayed still, my breath steadying again, the weight of what had just happened settling in. The guests began to shift back into their seats, though the energy was different now. Conversations were hushed but charged, glances darting toward me and then away. Robert remained where he was, shoulders stiff, his jaw working as if grinding words he didn't dare speak. I didn't move toward Grandma yet. There would be time for that. For now, I let the moment sit like the first pour from a bottle that had been sealed too long, opening into the air and changing everything it touched. The chatter in the courtyard faded into a dull hum as I stepped back toward the far end of the terrace. The heavy scent of roses and ripe grapes drifted in the air, but it did nothing to ground me. My mind had already slipped somewhere else, to a time before the titles, the legal battles, and the whispered accusations. I remembered being 8 years old, running between the vine rows while the fog from the bay curled low across the fields. Back then the vineyard felt like a kingdom, though I was never the favored child in its court. My father's hand always seemed to rest heavier on Sabrina's shoulder, his smile reserved for her piano recitals and school awards. When I brought home drawings or essays, his response was polite but distant, like he was humoring a stranger's child. Even at that age, I understood the unspoken hierarchy. Sabrina was the daughter who could do no wrong. I was the one who had to stay out of the way. That winter in 2021 was when everything shifted. A storm had swept across Northern California, rare for Napa, icing over the hills and cutting power for miles. I was living in Portland then, but when Grandma called and I heard the weakness in her voice, I packed my truck and drove through snow that fell in thick, blinding sheets. By the time I reached Carmen's Grace, she was feverish, coughing so hard it shook her frame. The house was cold, the generator out, her phone almost dead. There was no sign of my father or Sabrina. Later, I would find out they had been in Maui, sending photos of themselves drinking from coconuts. I stayed with her for 2 weeks, sleeping on the couch in the sitting room so I could hear if she woke in the night. I cooked soup on the wood stove, brought her tea, and read her the letters she had saved from my grandfather. It was the first time in years I felt like I belonged somewhere. It was during one of those evenings when the wind rattled the shutters and the fire crackled low that she took my hand and told me she had changed her will. I remember the way her voice caught, as if she wasn't sure she should even say it, but she wanted me to know. She said I was the only one who had shown her the kind of loyalty she could not buy. That moment had been buried under months of silence after she recovered. Calls went unanswered. Letters came back unopened. I had thought maybe she had changed her mind, or maybe my father had convinced her I was after her money. Now, standing in the shadow of the courtyard, I understood. He had made sure I was cut off. He and Sabrina had built a wall around her brick by brick until she could barely see past it. Grandma must have sensed my thoughts because later, when the crowd began drifting back toward the reception hall, she found me near the edge of the terrace. Her hand was warm when it closed over mine. "There is more you should know," she said, her voice low. "Do you remember the Carmen's Grace Scholars?" Of course I remembered. It was the scholarship program she had started 15 years ago, offering full tuition and living expenses for underprivileged students in the valley. Every year, she hosted a dinner for the recipients. It had been one of the few traditions that seemed to bring her joy. "I haven't seen anything about it in recent years," I said. "I thought maybe you stopped funding it." Her gaze shifted toward the hills where the vines shimmered gold in the late light. "I never stopped funding it, Marissa. But when I asked for the annual report last month, there was no mention of the scholarship at all. Not one line." A knot tightened in my stomach. "You think they shut it down?" She hesitated. "I think something happened to the funds. Money doesn't disappear by accident." The thought lodged in my mind and wouldn't let go. My father and Sabrina hadn't just tried to control the vineyard. If the scholarship fund was gone, it meant they had taken something that wasn't even for them. Something meant to give kids a chance they never had. I looked toward the reception hall where laughter was starting to rise again, brittle and forced. If they had misused that money, it was more than greed. It was theft. Grandma's hand squeezed mine gently before she let go. "I can't prove anything yet, but I know you. You will find out." The weight of her words settled on me like the winter snow from that storm 3 years ago. I had walked into this day expecting another cold dismissal, another reminder that I was an outsider in my own family. Instead, I had been handed something else entirely, a thread, and I knew I was going to pull it. I watched as she walked back inside her cane, tapping softly against the stone. The air felt different now, cooler despite the sun. Somewhere in the distance, the murmur of conversation swelled, the clink of glasses rising in time with the music. I stayed where I was for a moment longer, my eyes fixed on the edge of the vineyard. The light was fading, and with it the neat shadows of the vines began to blur. But in my mind, everything was sharper. The scholarship fund had been a promise. If that promise had been broken, I would find the proof. And when I did, it would not be whispered behind closed doors. It would be spoken in the open, the way Grandma had spoken the truth today. I turned toward the hall, the music and voices growing louder with each step, my mind already reaching forward to what I needed to do next. Halfway across the courtyard, a flicker of movement near the side gate caught my eye. A man stood half in the shadow of the stone wall, his baseball cap pulled low, his jacket collar turned up as if he didn't want to be recognized. I almost kept walking, thinking he was a vendor or one of the catering crew on a break, but then he lifted a hand in a quick, deliberate signal. "Marissa Wright," he said when I got close enough to hear. His voice carried that rough edge of someone who had been chewing on frustration for too long. "I'm Caleb Foster. I used to manage production here." I remembered the name vaguely. Someone had mentioned a shakeup in the staff last year, but I hadn't paid much attention. Still, there was something urgent in his eyes, a kind of contained desperation. "I think you should see something," he said, glancing toward the corner, as if expecting someone to appear. "Not here." I followed him out through the narrow service gate and into the gravel path that wound toward the parking area. The hum of the reception dimmed behind us. He stopped near a line of delivery vans and pulled a small flash drive from his pocket. "This," he said, holding it up, "is the reason they fired me." "What is it?" "Security footage. From the fermentation room." My pulse quickened. "And why would that get you fired?" "Because it shows your sister and your father in there at 2 a.m, he said flatly. "And they weren't just looking around. They were pouring something into one of the tanks." I stared at him. What tank? The last batch your grandmother worked on before she stepped back, he said. She was proud of it. It was supposed to be bottled last fall. I felt a cold rush down my spine. What were they pouring? Industrial solvent. I checked the supply inventory the next day. A jug was missing. He went on to explain how he had caught it on a motion-triggered camera he'd installed after a series of unexplained delays in production. He had taken the footage straight to Robert, thinking it was some kind of mistake, but within a week, Caleb was out of a job. The official reason was breach of protocol for installing unauthorized cameras. And the wine? I asked. They ordered a sanitation flush on that tank, he said. Signed off as an emergency cleaning after suspected contamination. Signature was Sabrina's. He paused. If that wine had been bottled, it would have been worth 6 figures at auction. I closed my hand around the flash drive, feeling its sharp edges press into my skin. Why are you bringing this to me? Because you're the only one with the leverage to do anything, he said. And because your grandmother deserves to know what they did. The air around us felt heavier. I knew this was more than just sabotage. This was about erasing the last tangible mark Grandma had made on the vineyard's craft. I'll look at it, I said, finally. And Caleb, thank you. His mouth twitched in something between a nod and a grimace. Just be careful. They don't play fair. I slipped the drive into the inside pocket of my dress jacket and walked back toward the building, the sound of my heels crunching on gravel louder than it should have been. Inside, the music hit me again, warm and falsely cheerful. I moved through clusters of guests until I reached an empty corner by the window. Pulling out my phone, I sent a quick message to someone I trusted in Portland asking if they could scan and duplicate the contents of a flash drive discreetly. I didn't want to be the only one holding this evidence. As I slipped the phone back, I caught sight of my father across the room. He was laughing too loudly with a pair of business associates, his hand resting possessively on Sabrina's arm. She wore that polished smile she had perfected for photographs, but her eyes darted once toward me and then away. I wondered if they already suspected I knew something. If they realized that each step I took now was toward a place they couldn't control. The thought of the scholarship fund rose again in my mind, weaving itself together with what Caleb had told me. If they were willing to destroy a batch of wine for reasons I couldn't yet see, what would stop them from siphoning money meant for students? The rest of the evening blurred. I made polite small talk with a few guests, keeping my eyes and ears open. Every casual laugh and whispered aside felt like a layer over something darker. When the band struck up another slow number, I excused myself and found a quiet corridor near the offices. The door to the administrative wing was locked, but I knew from working summers here that the key was usually kept behind the concierge desk. 10 minutes later, I was inside the dim hallway, the hum of the reception now just a faint echo. I didn't have time to search everything, but I found the file cabinet marked philanthropy and pulled the most recent reports. My fingers hesitated as I scanned the pages. The Carmen's Grace Scholars Program wasn't just absent from the financial summaries, it was scrubbed entirely as if it had never existed. I slid the files back exactly as I found them. My heart was steady now, the way it always was when I locked onto something I couldn't let go of. This wasn't the place to confront them, not yet. That would come later in a room where they couldn't lie their way out. But tonight I had taken the first steps. I walked back toward the reception, the weight of the flash drive pressing against my jacket like a promise. By Monday morning, I was standing outside the boardroom on the second floor of the administrative wing, my palms flat against the cool leather of my portfolio. Harvey Landon arrived right on time, his briefcase in one hand and that unshakable calm in his eyes. He gave me a quick nod before pushing the door open. Inside, the room was already filling with the low murmur of voices, the long mahogany table ringed with the vineyard's board members. The morning light spilled through the wide windows, glinting off the rows of framed wine awards that lined the far wall. Robert sat halfway down the table, a forced ease in his posture. Sabrina beside him in a silk blouse the color of champagne. She glanced at me once, and then down at her phone. We took our seats near the head of the table. Harvey placed a slim bottle wrapped in protective cloth on the table in front of him, and beside it a small drive in a clear evidence bag. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. Harvey began, his voice carrying without strain. This meeting concerns matters of significant urgency to the integrity of Carmen's Grace Vineyards. Robert leaned back, folding his arms. I hope this isn't going to be another one of Marissa's dramatics. I didn't answer. Harvey gestured to me and I slid the evidence bag forward. This is a copy of footage recorded in the fermentation room late last summer, Harvey said. The original has been secured. We will now view it in full. The lights dimmed and the screen at the far end flickered to life. Grainy black and white footage filled the space. There was no mistaking the two figures stepping into the room, glancing over their shoulders. Robert's profile was clear, the set of his jaw, the way he moved like he owned every inch of the place. Beside him, Sabrina lifted a large container, the label facing the camera for one unmistakable second. The footage showed them tilting it over the open hatch of a fermentation tank. A few murmurs rippled down the table. One of the older board members, Margaret Holt, shook her head slowly. The video ended. The silence that followed was sharp. Robert was the first to speak. This is absurd. That's not what it looks like. It looks exactly like what it is, Harvey said evenly. Sabotage of a production batch valued at approximately $120,000. Sabrina's voice cut in higher than usual. This is obviously staged. Caleb Foster has been holding a grudge ever since he was let go. He probably doctored this. From the back of the room, a chair scraped. Caleb stepped forward, a folder in his hands. If I may, he said, and Harvey nodded him toward the table. Caleb laid out a copy of his termination notice and the incident report that cited unauthorized surveillance equipment as the reason for dismissal. He pointed to the signature lines, the dates, the internal memos that contradicted each other. If I was making this up, why would they go to the trouble of writing two different explanations for firing me, Caleb said. The board members leaned in, scanning the pages. Margaret Holt looked directly at Robert. I have known your family a long time, she said, but this is not something we can ignore. Another member, a retired vintner named Paul Reeves, spoke next. I move that both Robert and Sabrina be suspended from any operational authority, pending a full investigation into this footage and related matters. Robert's chair creaked as he sat forward. You can't be serious. This is my vineyard. It is not your vineyard, Harvey replied quietly. And as of last week, you no longer hold controlling authority. The vote was swift. Hands rose one after another until only Robert's and Sabrina's remained lowered. Margaret recorded the motion as passed. Effective immediately, you are to refrain from entering any production or administrative areas without written clearance from this board. Margaret said, her voice clipped. Robert's face flushed a deep red, but he said nothing more. Sabrina stared at the table, her hands tight in her lap. Harvey began gathering the bottle and the drive. We will also be conducting a review of all financial and operational records, he added, particularly those related to charitable programs under the Carmen's Grace name. The mention of the scholarship fund was deliberate, and I caught the smallest flinch from Sabrina's posture. The meeting adjourned, chairs scraping back as members filtered toward the door. Harvey touched my arm lightly. This was the first step, he said. Now we follow the trail wherever it leads. I left the boardroom without looking back at Robert or Sabrina. The hallway smelled faintly of oak and cleaning polish, the same as it had when I was a teenager walking these floors during summer jobs. But this time I wasn't just an extra pair of hands. I had walked in with proof, and I had walked out with the board on my side. Outside, the spring air was bright and sharp, and for the first time in a long while I felt the ground under me was steady. There was still the scholarship fund to uncover, and likely more than I could guess, but now the path forward was clear enough to take the next step. Harvey called me early the next morning, his voice steady but edged with something heavier than usual. He asked me to meet him in his office above Main Street in downtown Napa. When I arrived, the blinds were half drawn, letting in narrow stripes of light that cut across the stacks of files on his desk. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. We've found something you need to see, he said, sliding a folder toward me. Inside were bank documents stamped and signed, the kind of records you couldn't fake without a team of forgers. The papers detailed a secured loan for $2.5 million taken out 6 months ago against a section of the lower vineyard property. I frowned, tracing the outline of the parcel map with my finger. This land is part of Carmen's Grace. How could they put it up without the board knowing? They didn't inform the board, Harvey replied. That's the problem. And the loan isn't just outstanding, it's in default. The words landed like a physical blow. If the lender moved to foreclose, we wouldn't just lose acreage. We'd lose some of the oldest vines, the ones my grandmother had worked alongside my grandfather to plant in the early 70s. Those vines were the heart of our reserve wines, irreplaceable in both quality and history. Who signed for it, I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Robert, as managing partner at the time, Harvey said, flipping to the signature page. And here a secondary signatory. Sabrina's name was scrawled beneath his, her handwriting neat but sharp, like she had pressed harder than necessary on the pen. My stomach tightened. This wasn't carelessness, this was calculated. What was it for? A personal development project in Sonoma, Harvey said. Luxury rental villas. They presented it as a guaranteed return to the bank. I almost laughed, the sound bitter. So they risked the vineyard's land for a side project. And now that project is stalled, Harvey said. Construction halted 2 months ago, financing fell through, and the interest rate on the loan jumped after the default. I closed the folder slowly. The board has to know. They will, Harvey said. This afternoon. By the time we entered the boardroom again, the tension was thicker than it had been during the sabotage meeting. Margaret sat with her hands folded, her expression unreadable. Robert and Sabrina were already there, and Robert's jaw clenched when he saw the folder in my hands. Harvey laid the documents on the table. We have uncovered a significant breach of fiduciary duty, he began. 6 months ago, Robert Cole and Sabrina Cole secured a loan of $2.5 million using a portion of the vineyard's property as collateral without board approval or disclosure. Margaret's gaze sharpened. Is this true? Robert shifted in his chair. It was an investment opportunity, the kind that could have doubled our money in a year. And now Margaret's tone was cold. It's delayed. Robert admitted, avoiding her eyes. Sabrina straightened. It's not my fault the investors pulled out. Robert turned to her, his voice rising. You pushed for it, Sabrina. You convinced me the villas would be a gold mine. Don't you dare pin this all on me, she shot back, color flooding her cheeks. You signed off on it. You handled the bank. Their voices overlapped, accusations bouncing between them like sparks in a dry field. The board members exchanged looks, some shaking their heads. Harvey's voice cut through. Enough. This is not about deflecting blame. This is about the fact that your actions have put irreplaceable vineyard land at risk. If the lender forecloses, that loss will be permanent. Margaret tapped her pen against the table. I propose we initiate emergency measures to protect the property, including immediate legal intervention to challenge the loan's validity based on the lack of board authorization. The vote passed with only Robert and Sabrina opposed. Robert leaned back, his face pale now, the flush drained from it. Sabrina stared at the wall, her mouth a tight line. As the meeting adjourned, Harvey gathered the documents. He glanced at me once, a subtle reminder that this was only one part of the tangle we were unraveling. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright, but the air had cooled. I could still hear Robert and Sabrina's muffled arguments spilling from the boardroom, their words indistinct but sharp. The fracture between them was widening, and I had a feeling it would split wide open before this was over. I cut across the courtyard, the gravel crunching under my shoes, and headed for the low stucco building that housed the vineyard's older records. The air smelled faintly of lavender from the hedges along the path, and for a moment it reminded me of summers spent here before the politics and betrayals. Those days felt like another life. The door to the archive office stuck halfway, swollen from years of damp winters, but I pushed it open and stepped inside. It was cooler here, dust hanging in narrow shafts of sunlight. Metal filing cabinets lined the back wall, each drawer labeled in block letters. I found the one marked Foundation and Scholarships, the paint on the handle chipped, and unlocked it with the key Harvey had slipped me earlier. The drawer groaned as I pulled it open, the scent of old paper rising up. I slid out the folders for 2021, 2022, and 2023, stacking them on the big wooden table in the center of the room. The older two were thick edges worn from handling, but the last one looked almost empty. In 2021, the Carmen's Grace Scholars Fund had awarded 8 scholarships, each file neatly assembled with applications, committee notes, and thank you letters from the recipients. The pages were full of ambition and gratitude. One boy planned to study soil science at UC Davis, another young woman had been accepted to a viticulture program in Oregon. By 2022, the stack was thinner. Only 3 recipients with half the documentation missing. There were no committee notes, no photographs from the award ceremony. Then I opened the 2023 folder. A single envelope sat inside holding the paperwork for one small grant, barely a quarter of the usual amount. The rest of the ledger entries for that year were tagged Event Budget Allocation. I followed the trail to the cross-reference binder, and my stomach dropped. The withdrawals matched catering invoices, floral arrangements, luxury tent rentals, and custom glassware orders. Sabrina's wedding. They had drained the scholarship fund to throw her a party. I flipped to the withdrawal forms. Everyone bore Robert's sweeping signature alongside Sabrina's tighter, more deliberate script. The dates lined up perfectly, ending just a week before the first catering trucks arrived at the vineyard. The anger didn't come in a burst. It settled in like a slow frost, creeping into every thought. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about the kids who had worked harvests in the cold mornings, cleaned tanks until their hands cracked, all while dreaming of the chance this fund was supposed to give them. I gathered the folders and walked out into the hall. The hum of conversation came from the break room where a small group of employees sat with coffee mugs in hand. Margaret was there, her hair pulled back, a streak of flour on her sleeve from the kitchen. Elena from the tasting room leaned against the counter while James and Victor from the cellar sat at the table. I placed the files in the center. You should all see this. They looked at me, puzzled at first, then began flipping through the papers. I watched their faces shift. Margaret's mouth tightened. This fund helped my son get to college, she said softly, not looking up. Elena's voice was sharper. These scholarships aren't charity. They're an investment in the community. Those kids carry our name. I pointed to the event invoices. That's where it went last year. James slammed his palm on the table. That's theft. Margaret looked up, her eyes steady. What's your plan? Restore it, I said, and make sure it's untouchable. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Elena straightened. You'll have help. The others nodded one by one. By the time the coffee pot was empty, we had an informal committee. Margaret would reach out to past donors, Elena would organize the annual harvest fundraiser, James, and Victor would connect with former scholarship recipients for stories we could share publicly. The mood in the room shifted from outrage to resolve, like a crew readying for harvest under a darkening sky. I felt the weight of the files in my hands again, but it was different now. They weren't just evidence of betrayal, they were the blueprint for rebuilding. Before leaving, I copied the key pages onto the office scanner, sending the files to a secure folder Harvey could access. Then I slipped the originals back into their cabinet and locked the drawer. As I stepped outside, the late afternoon light had softened, laying gold across the rows of vines. The air smelled faintly of fermenting grapes, even though crush season was months away. Somewhere behind me, laughter rose from the break room, sharp and defiant. The vineyard wasn't just soil and barrels. It was people, and today those people had chosen a side. By the next morning, the courtyard in front of the main tasting room had been transformed. Folding chairs were set in neat rows facing a small podium draped with a white cloth, the Carmen's Grace emblem embroidered across the front. The breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut rosemary from the planters, and beyond the low stone wall, reporters milled about, checking cameras and notepads. Grandma stood just inside the doorway, her ivory coat perfectly pressed, the silver tip of her cane catching the light. Harvey was beside her, sorting through a folder of documents. He glanced at me and nodded once, a signal that everything was ready. We stepped out together. The murmur of conversation softened into silence, cameras lifting to catch the moment. Grandma took her place behind the podium, resting both hands on the edges as if grounding herself in the wood. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice carrying clear and steady over the courtyard. She spoke first about the history of the vineyard, her years building it from a modest plot into a name respected across the valley and beyond. Then she shifted her tone, firming, "In recent months, this legacy has been put at risk by actions that cannot be ignored." She motioned to Harvey, who placed the first stack of evidence on the podium. The photographs and printed stills from Caleb's video were passed down the rows, reporters leaning in to study them. Images of Robert and Sabrina in the fermentation room at night, pouring from containers marked as industrial solvent. The second set of documents detailed the mortgage taken out against a section of vineyard land without board approval, showing the overdue balance and bank notices. A low hum spread through the crowd, the weight of the revelation settling. And finally, Harvey handed her the last folder. She paused before speaking, as if giving the moment room to breathe. "The Carmen's Grace Scholars Fund," she said, "was created to invest in the future of our community, to ensure that opportunity reached those willing to work for it. Last year, it was gutted to pay for private celebrations." The reporters scribbled furiously. Several heads turned toward the back, where Robert and Sabrina stood under the shade of the pergola, flanked by two of their friends. Robert's face was set in a mask of defiance, but Sabrina's gaze was fixed on the gravel at her feet. Grandma straightened. "The purpose of this gathering is not revenge," she said, "but restoration. We will repay the scholarship fund in full with interest. We will cover the mortgage to ensure no part of this land is lost. And we will rebuild trust with those who have carried us through harvest after harvest." She gestured toward me. "Effective immediately, Marissa will oversee the restoration of the scholarship program and community partnerships. She has my full confidence." The applause began tentatively, then grew until it filled the courtyard. A few reporters raised their hands for questions. One asked if Robert and Sabrina still held positions within the vineyard. Harvey stepped forward. "As of this morning, both have been suspended from all duties pending a full internal review." A ripple went through the crowd, followed by more questions about potential legal consequences. Harvey kept his responses measured, promising transparency while noting that certain matters were under attorney review. When the formal statements ended, Grandma stepped away from the podium and moved toward the reporters, speaking with them in small groups. I stayed near the side, watching as employees mingled with local residents who had come to see the event for themselves. Several people I didn't know approached to shake my hand, thanking me for what they called the courage to face this head-on. Across the courtyard, Robert leaned in close to Sabrina, his words low and tight, his expression dark. She shook her head, a quick, sharp motion before turning away from him. The fissure between them was widening, just as I had guessed. Margaret found me near the rosemary planters, pressing a warm paper cup into my hand. "You did good," she said simply. I looked over at the podium, now empty but still flanked by the neat rows of chairs. The reporters began packing up their equipment. The last of the documents returned to Harvey's leather case. The light was shifting, turning the stone walls gold, and the air carried that subtle quiet that comes after a storm when people start to believe in the possibility of calm again. As the crowd thinned, I caught Grandma's eye across the courtyard. She gave a single nod, the kind that didn't need words. The following morning began in a gray hush, the kind of quiet that makes even the sound of a closing door feel loud. I arrived at the vineyard before sunrise, the air crisp enough to make my breath visible. Caleb was already at the north gate, leaning against the post with a thermos in his hand. He handed me a cup without saying much, and together we looked over the rows that waited in the soft pre-dawn light. Somewhere in the distance, a lone bird called out, and it felt like the first real beginning we had had in a long time. Grandma joined us not long after, her cane tapping against the gravel in a steady rhythm. She wore her long wool coat, the same one I'd seen her in for years, and a scarf that smelled faintly of cedar. Without ceremony, she told us we were starting in the south field. That was where Carmen had once walked the rows at dusk, testing the grapes with her own hands, and it was where we would replant first. The soil there was dark and rich, holding on to the winter rain. Caleb walked ahead, marking damaged posts and setting aside tools. I knelt down, letting the dirt crumble between my fingers. It felt alive in a way that reminded me why people talked about land like it was part of the family. As we worked, Grandma told Caleb where each varietal would go, her voice firm, her eyes scanning the horizon as if she could already see the vines grown tall. By mid-morning, we had moved to the main office. The air inside still smelled faintly of varnish from the last renovation. On the far wall we hung a frame design that Grandma had kept hidden for decades. It was Carmen's expansion plan drawn in pencil on yellowed paper with notes in the margins in her neat looping script. When the frame was secure, Grandma stepped forward, tracing a line with her fingertip. She said this was meant to open in 2005 before things changed, and for a moment her voice faltered in a way I rarely heard. On my desk, a stack of documents waited. The scholarship fund restoration had been finalized the night before Harvey, making sure every cent was accounted for. But money was only part of it. We reached out to the high school principal, the community college dean, and local business owners willing to host interns. In those conversations, I saw the old respect for Grandma return, the kind that came from years of keeping promises to this town. Afternoons were spent in the fields planting Carmen's favored varietals. The cuttings had been flown in from the same Spanish estate where she had trained as a young woman. Caleb showed me how to examine the grafts, feeling for the right give in the stem to know they would take. It was slow, careful work. Dirt under our nails, wind at our backs, the kind of labor that demanded patience. One afternoon, I found Grandma sitting on the weathered bench by the west vineyard, her cane resting at her side. She told me she had planted those rows herself after my mother was born. The first harvest nearly failed because of an early frost, but they had managed to save it. She laughed softly, though there was a shadow in it, a reminder that every harvest carried risk. By the third week, there was a new rhythm to our days. Mornings began with Caleb walking the property, afternoons in the office, reviewing grant applications for the scholarship, and evenings sometimes spent walking the rows with Grandma. The tension that had clung to the place was loosening. Workers started staying a little later, sharing stories at lunch. Someone brought in fresh bread one afternoon, and for the first time in months, I heard laughter carry across the courtyard. Still, the absence of Robert and Sabrina lingered like an unspoken truth. They had not returned since the board meeting. The silence between them and Grandma was a gap that couldn't be crossed with a single conversation, and maybe never would. Late one Friday, as we locked up the storage barn, Caleb handed me a small wooden crate. Inside was a single bottle from the last vintage Carmen had overseen. The label was slightly worn, the glass cool in my hands. Caleb asked if we should open it now or wait until the first harvest from the new vines. I told him we'd wait. That night, I walked alone through the tasting room. The polished tables caught the warm light, glasses lined up with quiet precision on the shelves. Outside, the new plantings stretched toward the horizon, neat rows promising seasons ahead. For the first time in a long while, the vineyard felt like it was breathing again. Not just surviving, but ready to grow. I stood there for a while, letting the quiet settle around me, and thought about how much had been broken and how much still could be rebuilt. This was not the same vineyard I had walked into weeks ago, tense and brittle under the weight of family betrayal. It was something new, shaped by steady hands, and for the first time I believed we could carry it forward without losing what mattered most. The morning of the celebration broke clear and bright, the kind of spring day that seemed to carry its own quiet blessing. The vineyard was alive with the scent of tilled earth and wildflowers edging the stone walls. In the courtyard, long wooden tables were arranged under strands of warm lights, their surfaces dressed in white linen and small jars of rosemary sprigs. I moved between them, checking the settings, making sure every plate, every glass was exactly where it should be. This was not about perfection for show. It was about honoring the people who had helped us get here. By late afternoon, the first guests began to arrive. I greeted them at the gate, shaking hands, exchanging hugs, and feeling the warmth of their smiles. The crew from bottling brought baskets of bread baked that morning, still warm enough to release steam when torn. The vineyard hands carried crates of their own, produce a gesture that spoke louder than words. Teresa pressed a jar of her plum preserves into my palm with a wink. Caleb came in from the east field, his shirt sleeves rolled, carrying a bottle of Carmen's Grace from the cellar, the last one my grandmother had signed before her illness. The sound of conversation filled the courtyard, a soft hum broken by laughter and the clink of glassware. Lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, casting shifting patterns of gold over the stone floor. I glanced toward the head of the table where Grandma sat straight-backed and serene, her cane resting beside her. The pearl earrings she wore caught the light every time she turned her head. These gatherings had once been formal affairs for investors, all polished speeches and calculated gestures. Tonight felt different. It was rooted, real, and shared. As the sun dipped lower, Grandma stood. The movement was slow but steady, and when she raised her glass, the chatter faded until there was only the sound of the wind in the vines. She spoke of the road we had traveled, of the trials that had tested us, not just as a family but as a community. She thanked the workers who had tended the vines in heat and cold, who had stood firm when others tried to strip the vineyard of its integrity. Her voice was strong, her words carrying across the courtyard without strain. When she turned toward me, I saw the faintest glimmer in her eyes. She said I had brought back more than land or title. I had returned honor to the name carved into every barrel in the cellar. She spoke of my stubbornness, my unwillingness to look away when something was wrong, and how those qualities had given the vineyard not just a future but a chance to thrive on its own terms. She ended with a toast to holding on to what matters and knowing when to fight for it. The applause came quickly, filling the night air with warmth. I rose, my glass cool in my fingers, and let my gaze sweep across the faces gathered there. I told them this victory was more than a line on a deed or an entry in a ledger. It was the preservation of the spirit Carmen had poured into every harvest, the same spirit that had carried us through storms and frost and seasons when the yield was thin but the hope was still full. I reminded them of the winter I had sat by Grandma's bed through the night, the scholarship students who had once arrived here wide-eyed, eager to learn, and the long days of harvest when we shared meals at the end, exhausted, but certain of our purpose. These were the things worth guarding, and now we had the chance to build on them without compromise. Plates of roasted vegetables, grilled meats, and fresh bread began to circulate. The musicians in the corner played something light, their melodies weaving into the soft murmur of conversation. I caught sight of Caleb showing two younger workers the plans for a new section of vines, his finger tracing the outline under the lantern light. Grandma leaned close to the Riveras, listening intently as they discussed expanding the vegetable plots. Every corner of the courtyard seemed to hold a piece of the future being shaped in real time. As the evening deepened, I stepped away from the table and wandered toward the edge of the property. From there, the vineyard stretched out in orderly rows, the young leaves catching the last traces of daylight. The air was cooler now, filled with the scent of earth and a faint sweetness from the blossoms on the far edge. I thought about how close we had come to losing it all and how every step since had been about more than survival. It had been about reclaiming the heart of this place and the dignity that had been under threat. When I returned, dessert was being served, small tarts topped with berries from the nearby orchards. People lingered, leaning back in their chairs, their laughter rising into the night. The lanterns swayed above them, and for a moment I let myself believe we could hold this balance, that the vineyard would remain not because of contracts or titles but because people had chosen to protect it together. As the night began to wind down and the last glasses of wine were poured, I stood once more. My voice carried easily over the courtyard, quieting the tables. I thanked them for their trust, their labor, and their faith in the vineyard's future. Then I told them something I had come to understand. The battles worth fighting are rarely about land or buildings. They are about the values that anchor us, the connections we refuse to let be broken. I let my gaze rest on each table before I spoke the final words. If you have ever been at the edge of a choice between staying silent or protecting what you knew was right, I want to hear your story. Tell me how you chose and what it cost, because those choices are the ones that shape not just places like this, but the people we become.